and welcome to another episode of Litigators Corner. And I am here today with Sharyn Tejani, who is the director of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, an organization that probably needs no introduction. But Sharyn, thank you so much for coming today.
Well, Hillary, thank you so much for having me.
Sharyn, I know that your organization is very well known, but please tell us about yourself and what you do, and as importantly, what your organization does.
Sure. So I've been working at the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund now for about 3 years. And the fund started about 3 years ago when a group of actresses came forward about Harvey Weinstein and sexual harassment. And then the Me Too went viral because of Alyssa Milano talking about Tarana Burke's work. And that led to a group of people coming together and talking about workplace sex harassment. And right at that point, a group of farm workers with Alianza wrote a letter to the actresses. And they said, we support you, we believe you, we know this happens in your workplace because it happens all the time in our workplace. And that made the whole idea of we should do something about workplace sex harassment, but it should be something that touches all industries and it should focus on low-wage workers. So after that, some money was raised, and the group of people who raised the money went to the National Women's Law Center. The National Women's Law Center is an almost 50-year-old women's rights organization that works on all types of women's issues, including workplace sex harassment. And the National Women's Law Center had just started a new project called the Legal Network for Gender Equity, because the administration had just changed, and the National Women's Law Center knew that the civil rights organizations that were part of the government probably wouldn't be doing as much work. And they wanted a way to help people who are facing sex discrimination and harassment to be able to find attorneys. So they created something called the Legal Network for Gender Equity to help people find attorneys. And the people who raised the money from Time's Up Legal Defense Fund came to the National Women's Law Center and said, you all are experts on workplace sex harassment. And what we want to do is be able to help people bring these workplace sex harassment cases. And the National Women's Law Center, of course, jumped at this opportunity because they've been working on this issue for years and years and years. I've been a lawyer for almost 20 years now, and I've worked on women's rights issues and sex harassment issues and workplace issues. And at no point in my career at any time would I have thought that people would actually care about workplace sex harassment, especially workplace sex harassment for low-wage workers. And so between the National Women's Law Center and Time's Up, they created the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, where we help people who are facing workplace sex harassment in a variety of ways.
And I know that that's often a common complaint, that there are some people who have the financial means will, in all likelihood, have their grievances addressed, or at least have that option. But there's such a large part of society. I know that the classic example is what about the waitress in the diner who gets harassed every day or on a weekly basis, maybe by a regular customer or by her boss, or the single parent often women, not always women, men too, and that gets harassed and really does not feel that they can do anything about it. One, because they don't have access to the legal system, or they may not know about it, and two, because they need their job. They may be living paycheck to paycheck, they have mortgages, they have other responsibilities, and they're concerned that there may be a stigma, or that they won't be believed, or that they won't have strong representation. I mean, there's often, I'm not saying it by any means the public defenders, for the classic example would be criminal defense, and they say, well, you're getting the public defender. Oh no, a lot of public defenders are excellent, as we all know. But there's a concern about not having equal access to the system, and finances do play a part in that.
Absolutely, finances play a part in it, and so does just basic access. I mean, there's certain people who know how to find a lawyer who does certain kind of work, right? That's just something you know because you're a lawyer, of course you know that. But you have friends who you can talk to, if you're in a business world. But for most people, that's not what the situation is. For most people, they're facing this situation. They don't know what to do. As you've said, they're very worried about coming forward. They're very worried about complaining. And so one of the things we do through the Legal Network for Gender Equity and Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is we help people find attorneys. And so for that, people fill in the form on our website. And if it has to do with workplace sex harassment, we send them the names of 3 attorneys in our network. And attorneys in our network agree to give anybody coming through our network a first consultation for free. And it's at that consultation that the person can really talk about what happened to them, see if they have a case, see if the attorney wants to take the case. So it's even that very basic getting connected to attorneys that some people simply don't have the access to be able to do, especially low-wage workers. And since we've started about 3 years ago, we've helped over 4,000 people connect with attorneys.
That is amazing.
Yeah, and most of those are low-wage workers. About 75% identify as low-wage workers.
Okay. And how many attorneys are in your network? I'm actually one of your network attorneys.
I know.
I was impressed at how easy that the resources that you provide a lot of training that if I hadn't already been trained in that, or thought, that's a really good idea. You train about trauma, you train about, how to address certain political issues. How many lawyers do you currently have in your network?
We have a little over 500 attorneys in our network. And we ask attorneys, as you know, to register every year. And so some move in, some move out, and so that can always change. We do also require that attorneys do some form of trauma-informed training. That can be our training or someone else's training, because we think that's a really important part when you're dealing with people who have faced workplace sex harassment. So many times, the attorney is the first person that the worker has ever told that this happened. They've been afraid to tell their family. They've been embarrassed. It's such a normal thing when people come to us for them to say things like, I did everything I could to make it stop. I walked around my office in a different way. I took a different route to the bathroom. I changed what I was wearing. People really feel like it's their fault. And one of the first things we always say is it isn't. We know this because we talk to people in every single industry. The people who've come forward to us have touched every single industry you can think of. And we know that it happens everywhere. It's not about anything that the individual worker has done. It's about a system where people feel like they can abuse their power and use their power to sexually harass because they know that especially low-wage workers need these jobs and are going to be afraid to come forward.
Exactly, and a lot of it is, as we know, similar to rapes and sexual assaults and domestic violence. A lot of it is about power and control, and
right.
Is they're used to doing things in entitlement and is establishing dominance, and there are a lot of other factors to go into it. And I was impressed as an attorney how easy you guys made it for all of us, because often attorneys want to volunteer or want to be involved and want to do that kind of pro bono work, particularly with a prestigious organization such as yours that is really at the forefront of this movement, and just a lot of really amazing changes that are going on in society. What I always say is we always knew this was wrong. Now it's just illegal. And it's people, you did not know. And a lot of people were in a system for years where they're just like, well, I guess I just have to put up with this if I want to be part of the workforce. And just all the incidental things that happen where you lose a lot of good people because they don't want to deal with this anymore. They're going to go into other professions or lesser paying jobs and maybe not use their talents. And, for any of you lawyers who are interested in getting involved, it is really easy to do. They have training. They are very accommodating. They are very friendly. And I'm very impressed with, I always hear back from everyone. Everyone is willing to help. I've consulted with some of the clients on these. I know that I think I worked with you about one of my clients actually testifying before Congress about certain maternity, pregnancy leave rights and things like that. And they are really, it's really just stunning what a great job they've done and how efficient and professional they've been. What kind of improvements are you seeing with your organization in the last few years? What are you noticing, Sharyn?
Well, first of all, Chloe, thank you so much for your kind words. What we are trying to do is make sure that we can continue to serve as many people as we can. And so part of that is making sure our intake system is still working. Part of that is thinking about what other resources people need when they come to us. And so, lawyers are very important, but we also want to think about, can we connect them to hotlines? Can we connect them to health services? Those are the kinds of things we would love to expand into because, as you know, because you've talked to people who've gone through this, while they need legal help, a lot of people need a lot of help in other areas, and that would be something we would love to do more of to make them have a complete experience and have the support that they actually need. You did mention, volunteering with us, and that's right. We ask lawyers to volunteer with us and fill in our form on our website, www.nwlc.org. And once you do that and you become a member, you can hear our trainings. We'll send you people if we get people from your area. But I think it's also important to note that we also fund cases. And so for that, attorneys apply to us, and then we review the applications. We have certain priorities that we look for. And if we can actually help fund the case. And that matters so much, especially for low-wage workers, because you certainly have attorneys who would love to take the case, but the risk is too high to take it without some sort of financial, somebody to help you with the finances of it, whether that's paying for depositions, paying for your time as you're doing the investigation and deciding whether to take the case. All of that we can help pay for. And that we think really helps, especially for low-wage workers who, the way the law works, you oftentimes might not be able to recover a whole lot. And so we want to make sure that the attorneys have an incentive to take these cases. Mm-hmm. Another thing that we do for many cases is we help with media assistance. And so for that, again, attorneys reach out to us if they have a case that they think is appropriate. We do a screening call and we see whether it's a good case for media assistance. And we do that because we know that for some people, they've come forward too late. The statutes of limitations are very tight in a lot of states and in the federal law. And so people may be coming forward, but they simply can't bring a case, but they still want to talk about what happened to them and they want to be public about it. So that's one set of people we help with our media assistance. Another set of people are people who, for their case, it's really helpful to get media attention. And then a third set are people who don't want media attention, but their case is drawing media attention. So we can help with that as well. And we do this because we know that one of the really important ways to stop workplace sex harassment for all of us is for more people to come forward and is for these stories to become public. And every time someone speaks out about it publicly, there's this ripple effect where other employers, start to pay attention, or other workers think, oh, well, if that person can come forward and talk about it, maybe I can as well. And so we really try to get these stories out in the public as much as we can to the extent that it's helpful for the workers. And then the final thing we do is we fund outreach grants to groups that work with low-wage workers, specifically about workplace sex harassment. So these workers can learn more about what resources are out there and what they can do when they're facing workplace sex harassment.
Yeah, and I think you hit upon so many really salient topics. One, the use of the media, because as we all know, we do, here in LA, we do a lot of work in Hollywood, and, and with any company you work with too, there are getting that kind of notoriety or that public attention is often the last thing an employer wants. We've seen these cases. Once there's an allegation made, the person's like, sorry, your contract's canceled. There is a consequence there. So maybe you don't win in the court of law, or maybe it's the statute is passed. That is changing. For example, Governor Newsom this year extended the DFEH complaints to 3 years instead of 1. So there is time there, but there's the issue of stale complaints, prosecutions, maybe there's a history, negligent hiring and retention. So it does make a huge difference there. And again, there are a lot of companies these days and businesses, if there are allegations like that going on in a company, other companies may not want to do business with them. So it does make a difference in that it adversely affects people who are not adhering to these standards and are not doing that. Or maybe someone thinks twice about doing business with them or hiring them, or if there's another claim. And I know that I have spoken to the district attorneys about sex crimes and assaults, and maybe they don't have enough to prosecute originally, or the claim was brought too late, or they're, particularly during the pandemic, where unfortunately they're and not prosecuting as much. But these claims with these information, when you're making them, they go, wait, this guy's done this before. There was an allegation back here. And them being aware of that really can help on so many levels. And I think what I hear from people who have been harassed is, one, that they've been believed. Yeah. Someone is listening to them, and they often say, it's not so much what happened just then, it was how I was treated afterwards. Through, and no one believed me, and I didn't really think I was being treated with respect. And I think that having organizations like yours that do that really encourage and validate people on so many different levels, which is a really essential part of it, because that's why they call it the Me Too movement. There's a lot of people go through this who never say anything.
Right.
Never.
Your point about what happens after you complain. So we actually had researchers go through over 3,000 of the forms that we received from people talking about what happened to them, to look for trends, to see how people were experiencing workplace sex harassment. And what we found when we looked through these thousands of forms was that about 7 out of 10 people, when they reached out to us, told us that after they reported, they were retaliated against. And that can mean, losing your job, which was actually the most frequent one. It can mean losing shifts. It can mean being disciplined. It can mean, something that was perfectly fine in the workplace up until you complain suddenly becomes a huge problem and you're getting all this grief about it. So that was really disconcerting to hear that retaliation is so common. And it's definitely something that employers should be checking on and making sure that they're not doing, because as you know, retaliation is as illegal as the harassment in the first place. And so employers really need to make sure that they're looking at that. That same study, we looked at people's financial situation, what happens after you've been sexually harassed. And we found that over 20% of the people told us about how their financial situation had suffered because of the workplace sex harassment. And about 1 in 5 told us about how their mental health had suffered because of the workplace sex harassment. So it really is such a huge problem for workers. And then, as you can imagine, with the pandemic and COVID, that creates a whole nother set of issues because unemployment is so high. And so if you're lucky enough to have a job, I think you're much less likely to want to complain at that job because you can't afford, you never can afford to lose a job. But in this situation, it's gotten even worse because there's so many people looking for jobs. Mm-hmm. And also COVID just isolates us so much. It means that the support system that you may have to rely on normally just isn't there anymore because you can't see some people. And so that makes it so much more difficult as we're going through this really difficult time.
Yeah, I've heard of just some abhorrent examples of how badly, and we do employer defense as well as plaintiffs work, and we just where they'll say, oh, well, this person could never do it. Let's have a meeting with you and the person who harassed you. Let's work this out together. I mean, just such ridiculously bad judgment, but it does hit on a lot of it, and those are certainly signs to look for. And, the classic I always say is, look, if you had someone who's performing at a minimum competently or maybe a bright and bubbly person, and then you see a distinct change in their behavior, taking the temperature, maybe something happened there, and, interviewing witnesses that may know what happened, but they don't want to get involved. Off-site events, a lot of people, there's the classic these days, I think, that people say, well, we're off the clock, so this isn't really a work. I'm like, no, it is. And they're like, oh, texting at night, social media posts, things like that, where they're just not paying attention to maybe workplace bullying or other kinds of things that are making people very uncomfortable. I mean, my personal opinion is any decent human being would not do this anyways. So I have if it really does happen, very limited sympathy in these situations. What I was encouraged to see on the business side of this, and I don't know how much you encounter this, is that EPLI insurance is a lot more available to companies too. And it's good in the respect that there's actually, usually the company looks and goes, well, this is coming out of my pocket. I'm not paying that. I'd rather pay a lawyer. But when there's insurance involved, and depending if it's posted on media, things like that, it gives the plaintiff and the employer a lot more options, because there are situations I found where maybe the employer really didn't know. Mm-hmm. I mean, even if it's a small size company, oh my God, I didn't know about this at all. And then you got this claim, and is often the person who is harassing the other person may not have resources. The employer may be the one to go to and to sue. So the employer gets dragged into it for various other reasons. And it can become more complex for everybody and unnecessarily complicated. But what are you seeing a trend towards more reports being made since organizations like yours have been formed? What are your observations?
So right when we started, we got a huge number of people reaching out to us. And since then, it's been pretty steady. And we had a drop in March when a lot of the stay-at-home orders happened. But then since then, it's gone right back up. And it stays pretty steady at about 80 or so a month. And so, we haven't seen it sort of going, except for at the very beginning when there were a lot. We haven't seen it changing in that way. I will say, though, that the EEOC has seen an increase in the number of sex harassment charges it's processing and settling and doing well with. So there's definitely been, I think, more charges filed with them, and more people coming forward because of all the things that we've seen.
And I did notice that the EEOC and the DFEH for California has actually done a very impressive job of turnaround time for rights to sue letters and things like that. I had thought during the pandemic there'd be substantial delays. Trigger wants to make an appearance here. We're living in the golden age of pets. It's the he's our YouTube star. It's yeah, but what is they're doing a very impressive job and very efficiently. We get the updates from the EEOC and things like that. And why don't you sit here? Okay. He's my co-host. But they've done a very impressive job of turnaround time and getting rights to sue letters out and things like that. They really
sort of. So for attorneys, when attorneys are asking for the right to sue notice, great, that makes perfect sense.
Right.
But the National Women's Law Center has been part of the groups that have been pushing for the EEOC to halt the issuance of right to sue notices unless they're requested because of the pandemic, because people are losing their housing. It's really hard to, it's hard to find an attorney normally. It's exceptionally hard to find an attorney in the middle of a pandemic when you've lost your job, when you may have lost your electricity, when you don't have Wi-Fi. I mean, all of these things are so difficult for so many different workers. And so the idea that you get a right to sue notice and you have 90 days and you have to respond can be very difficult. So we've actually been trying to convince the EEOC, and for a while there, the EEOC did stop issuing right to sue notices, but they picked it back up again, and it's going to be very hard for workers who aren't able to find someone to represent them.
Yeah, and that comes back, I think, to access and knowing who to call. As lawyers, I think we almost take for granted, I'll just call such and such, or I'll call maybe they know somebody, because we don't all know each other, but lawyers know other lawyers, or they could call a bar chair. There are people they could reach out to and resources that are readily available online and through associations. And a low wage worker would not know about that. That's just a different world. They're isolated during the pandemic. They're worried about where their next meal is coming from, or their next check is coming from. If you're unemployed, EDD is, at least in California, is very backed up. I'm not saying they're not can, but I'm assuming that's like that in other states where people are waiting months to get minimal checks, and it's not going to be enough for them. And those are genuine survival concerns about what am I going to do, and there are only so many resources to go around it. Not only the emotional trauma they've been through, the stress and the worry, but am I going to find anybody who's willing to help me? And oftentimes we have people in the office who speak Spanish and English, but there are sometimes there are language barriers, there are cultural barriers as well, or issues that need to be addressed. And it's hard to find someone who is sensitive to those and is actually willing to take the case, or at least help them and at least show them that. What do you say to lawyers who want to get involved with either maybe providing at a minimum some volunteer work or consulting with people and helping them, or that may want to take on cases? What would you tell our attorney listeners? Because I know a lot of people mention, I didn't know if I could do that. And I think there's, as busy lawyers, we don't often take the time to look into what we need to do to help.
So you should certainly come volunteer with us, and you can fill in, that was the perfect question. You can fill in the sheet to have you become a volunteer, and it explains what your responsibilities are, that you'll respond to people who come to us, that you'll give them the first consultation for free, that you'll talk through with them what their options are. We also give attorneys and the people a list of other resources that they can try. If the attorney can't help, here are some other resources or other places to go to find help or to find another attorney. So we can provide all of that to the attorneys. And as you pointed out, we also do training for the attorneys on things like how to be trauma informed, certain developments in the law. We just did a training on harassment through the internet and different ways of responding to it and what we're seeing in that. So all of that is available to attorneys in our network.
Which is also very helpful for any attorney's practice, whether they're doing plaintiff's work or defense work, and any good business lawyer should know these too. I mean, I think sometimes people think that as lawyers, we tend to divide things up and categorize them. Well, this is employment law, this is entertainment law, this is business law, that's insurance. But I think any good lawyer should know several areas of the law. And I think given the issues with sexual harassment, I think anybody who's in the business world, which is pretty much all of us, or comes into contact, even in a school setting or anything else like it, or even in a social group or a volunteer group or a community organization. I think this is such a pervasive, prevalent issue that I think anybody could benefit from learning more about sexual harassment, what it is, if you have kids, if you're a coach, if you're a teacher, so people can learn, what it is and what your rights are and where to go for help. I know that I teach a sexual harassment prevention class, and a lot of it is I tell employers, you need to tell them where to go to get help. You need to tell these people, and not just the victims, maybe the people who witnessed it, maybe the people who are involved in this, because it can also be incidentally sexual harassment doesn't just hurt the person who is harassed. It hurts companies, it hurts, people, other people there. It makes, it can create an environment of a lot of stress and tension. And maybe a person, how often have we seen this? One person gets harassed, people know about it, and they're worried like, well, it may be worse next time. Maybe he or she, because it's not just men, will do it to me. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm living in fear or apprehension about, oh God, am I going to be next? Do I not say anything? It really affects so many people that, it's any good lawyer should at a minimum know the basics about trauma and be sensitive to those issues.
I think that is so important. And, one of the other things employers can do besides letting people know where they can go to complain is making sure that whatever sort of employee assistance program they have has people who know how to talk to people who've been through trauma, right? Because that's probably the first place that an employee might reach out to, and it's also confidential, so they might feel safer doing that. And it's really important that those employee assistance programs have the staff and have the knowledge about how to deal with these situations.
And actually invest in that person being trained, because they have an HR person, they're like, oh yeah, I watched a video, and you're like, oh, the person just does not know. The classic at a minimum, they did their job, but sometimes you feel like the person's just reading a book, like they're reading a checklist or something like that. And one of the biggest complaints I hear from plaintiffs, regardless of what side I'm on, is that it's not just that this happened, but when I went to complain, they didn't really seem to know how to handle it. They were sensitive. And sometimes what employers don't realize is it can be made worse if it is not handled well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that what we see and what the EEOC's charge data will tell you as well is that retaliation is one of the most common charges that is filed, and we see it so much in the people who are coming forward to us, and it creates its own legal ramifications. And it is quite common for the harassment to be one thing, but the retaliation to be the thing that actually catches the employer, because that's the thing that's easier to prove in certain cases.
And something the employer has more control of, because they may not know about the incident, what was going on, but once they know, that's their negligence. And whether it's true or not, there is the perception that all employers are rich and they're going to go straight to them. So often the person just goes to another job or things like that. The person who really caused the problem, and the employer's negligence or maybe lack of attention or lack of education or sensitivity to the issue is the one they wind up getting paid out. So the actual perpetrator moves on and does it to someone else.
That is quite common, that we see that, the perpetrator gets transferred to another side of the firm or transferred to another physical location, but nothing actually happens. And then, of course, they are emboldened and will harass again. And so it is very important that employers take this seriously and try to figure out how to stop it from happening.
Right. And I know there are complications. I always tell them, you need to make sure if someone's transferred, particularly if it's a person being punished, this is not a promotion in any way. They're not being rewarded for this kind of behavior. We're taking steps to protect you and have limited confidentiality and things like that. Are you seeing that people are more comfortable coming forward as a whole? I know it's a generalization. Are you feeling encouraged by all this?
Certainly the numbers and the people who are willing to talk publicly are encouraging, because I don't think that has been what has been before, right? I mean, I've been doing this work for a long time, and I think people are much more willing to talk about what's happened and much more willing to come forward. But it's also just hard to know, it's like that iceberg problem, right? Like you can only see the tip of it and you don't know what's going on underneath the water. And so I think it's also much more widespread than people actually can see, because it's the rare person actually who comes forward about workplace sex harassment. Most people, put up with it or live through it or leave the job because they can't deal with it anymore, but don't actually go through the process of complaining because that can be very difficult.
What would you say to victims of sexual harassment about getting help?
The first thing I would say, which is what I always say, is know that it's not your fault. You didn't do anything to make this happen. This isn't about how you dressed. This isn't about who you are. This isn't about how you look. We know this because we see workplace sex harassment happening in every single industry, in all kinds of workplaces. This is not something that you did. And so you have to know that you're not at fault here. The other person is at fault. If you feel comfortable addressing that person and telling them to stop, then that's something that you should do. If you don't, because they're a supervisor or you're afraid for your job, you should look at what your employer's policies are, and you should follow those to the extent that you can, because that can change whether or not the employer is liable for what happened to you. And so it's important to follow the policy if you can. You can go to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They're the federal agency that takes workplace sex harassment complaints, or in California, the state agency that does it as well. You can file a complaint there. You can come to us at www.nwlc.org and fill in an intake form, and we can help you find an attorney to talk to. It's also important, if you can, to keep track of what's happened to you. And so whether that's writing it down, whether that's taking screenshots of texts or emails, and keeping it in a safe place so that your harasser can't find it, and a place that you can access. And so, for example, keeping it on your phone can be problematic because at some point, all of us lose our phones break. And so it's great to have it in a place that's actually secure, where you'll be able to find it when you need it, because litigation can take a while and you might need things much later on down the line. There are also lots of resources on our website about people to talk to if you have an emergency, if you need someone to talk through what's happened to you, not a lawyer, but someone like a therapist or someone who can talk you through what you can do for your next steps. And so those are important resources that are out there for you to access.
And I do also advise, I don't know how you feel about that, for persons to, if they have physicians, maybe talk to them, make them feel comfortable seeing a therapist. Maybe they don't feel comfortable going to anybody at work yet, but it is important to talk to someone, whether you tell a trusted friend or if it's a family member, or go to someone for advice, or maybe it's someone in your church if you attend church. There are people who have duties as well as duties of confidentiality. So if you're concerned about other people knowing, or you're not really decided how you want to proceed, maybe you're not comfortable coming out yet, and this happened, and you need help, but maybe you don't want to do that. I think there are a lot of ways to get help. And we also, if anybody is viewing, if anybody becomes suicidal or is thinking about taking their own life, it is really important. There are hotlines and people to help you. You're worth it. Your life is worth it. And whoever did this to you is not worth it. And, you got to realize that you're more than this incident, and you're more than this harassment.
Yeah, that's a very important point. The other thing I've seen some employers do is create sort of anonymous hotlines. And so that can be helpful, for that situation where you don't know if you're ready to come forward, but you want some more information. And so that can be very helpful. There's a double-edged sword there, of course, because for liability purposes, the employer sometimes has to know what happened. And so reporting it to the anonymous hotline may not count for liability purposes, but it may be the right way to go for some employees.
Exactly. And what would you tell attorneys who want to be more involved, some of the ways they can get involved? If not through your organization, what else they can do to help?
Well, there's certainly lots of work on the state level about how to change and improve and strengthen workplace sex harassment laws. That's very important and needs lots of attorney support, because it's often attorneys that lawmakers go to see how these laws would work, or to see what ideas could be used to help improve the situation when it comes to workplace sex harassment. And those laws cover things like mandatory training, limiting the use of NDAs, changing the standards for what counts for workplace sex harassment. So those are all possibilities.
Sharyn, what would your parting words be to our viewers about what you would want them to know about you and the organization?
Volunteer with us, please. As many attorneys as we have, we are just sort of constantly needing more. And with the pandemic, of course, so many attorneys, it's created difficulties for attorneys who are practicing. It's limited what they can do. Some smaller firms have gone out of business. So we really do need more volunteers. And so if people are interested, please come and volunteer with us.
Okay, and I have that information too. I'm the litigation chair. You guys can contact me too. Sharyn, thank you so much. This was so helpful. I've been just a huge fan of your organization, and I so admire all the work that you are doing. And I know that it isn't always easy, but this is certainly worthwhile and something that I think is really going to create a lasting effect on our society. And I hope our laws and how people view sexual harassment. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.